Okay. Um, there's a lot of stuff that we can probably say about climate change because we know so much about climate systems. So we can make specific predictions, and your book has some really thoughtful ones. Thing is, there's a lot of stuff that we can't predict. We don't know where the tornadoes will show up. We don't know specific weather forecasts for most parts of the world. Um, the economic implications are potentially giant, but there's also economic opportunity in climate change. So maybe somebody will get rich from cool inventions or something. But I've got a list of really simple, really safe predictions, like no brainer predictions. Like, we know how much climate has changed and we know how much climate factors in to everyday life. So here's some basics that we absolutely know that was not in your book. I think the list is 11, and I recommend that you keep this with you. Um, Number one, we know that global weather patterns will change. Can't really get too specific, but weather is the interaction between high pressure and low pressure created by heat and cold, and adding more heat will shift that system pretty much everywhere. So it's a safe bet that the equator and the 60s will overall get wetter, and that the 30s plus the poles will overall get drier. Beyond that, exactly who gets hotter, who gets colder, who gets wetter, who gets drier, that's kind of tough to be certain. But one thing that we do know is everything will be different for the average person. So housing has to change, transportation systems have to change, drainage, construction standards, agriculture, recreation. Think of all the stuff that our daily lives require a stable climate. The clothes you own might not be warm enough, or your house might not have good enough drainage. Maybe the roof's always been good enough, but after a big storm, you realize it's not anymore. Maybe your retaining wall was stable, but not after a big flood. Um, the implications on specifically housing and transportation are pretty fascinating and pretty likely to increase globally. Number two, I want you to remember that individual species can always tolerate a couple degrees hotter. Polar bears love it when it's warm. I saw a polar bear at a zoo in Tennessee, and that was the happiest, fattest, biggest polar bear I've ever seen. They don't really care about the heat. It's not the temperature of global warming. Be very careful. Lazy students say this on the AP test all the time. And it's one of those things in the key that we're supposed to look out for and not give you credit for. Don't say the temperature is dangerous. Watch how many kids are going to blow it on the next exam. It's not the temperature that kills individuals or causes extinctions. The way that climate affects ecosystems is that relationships don't line up anymore. Species can adapt really easily to temperature. It's not like evolutionary adaptation, it's just a behavioral change. The bird flies further, or the birds fly uphill. It's not like you've evolved to respond, it's using existing flexibilities, tolerance. But what happens is the relationships between species no longer line up. That's called ecosystem shear or behavioral segregation. That's a new way to describe the same concept. So imagine if the flower opens and dries up before the insect hatches, right? The flower does fine with a warmer temperature, it just develops more quickly. And so when the flower opens up, on average, the flies still haven't hatched. And so without a pollinator, the flowers can go extinct. Without the source of pollen, the flies can go extinct because their relationship doesn't line up anymore. Um, This really affects birds, it really affects insects, it really affects plants. Think about how low that is on the food chain. So then the implications travel upward through the food web. Um, Also affects migratory animals because timing is really specific. Migratory routes have um, adapted for species that are, sorry, migratory routes have um, grown around places where species can reliably depend on a food item. So the migratory bird catches the crab egg laying event, then it catches the dragonfly breeding event. And for that bird, those are the pit stops that allow it to reach a distant destination. So climate change has huge impacts on migratory species. Number three, whatever you used to grow is going to be tough to grow. Maybe it's a little hotter so your beans don't dry out correctly, or maybe it's a little bit wetter so you have new diseases for the corn. And agriculture is pretty well established. Like, you'll go to the heartland of the United States, there's people who've been growing that one type of corn on that one field for 2 generations or 3 generations. The dudes in Idaho that have been growing potatoes for like 150 years. Agriculture's not really good at, like, oh, I guess now we can grow beans. Like, that transition is difficult because the machinery, the experience, the irrigation, the type of fencing for the type of pests, that's not an easy thing to change. It's like asking every mechanic to start doing a different kind of vehicle. Like, dude, I got all the tools for a motorcycle. How can I work on a car? A lot of that overlaps, but a lot doesn't. So we do expect that global food supply will go down, and that's already been seen. That's not a long-term projection. That's a continuation of a current trend. Number four, we also know that the world's water supply will change. Some of the largest nations on the planet have a majority of their water coming from glaciers that are shrinking really, really fast. Remember, glaciers on average are stable or growing because they're so high up that they gain snow during the winter, and then they'll melt a bit during the summer, but then they regain that snow. What makes them glaciers is that their average mass doesn't change. But on a warming planet, they lose weight in a longer summer, and then they don't gain enough in the winter, so they're overall on a decline. And a lot of glaciers are disappearing quickly. This is a major threat to humanity's water sources. About a third of humans get at least some amount of their drinking water from glaciers. About a quarter to a fifth of humans get the majority of their drinking water from glaciers that are disappearing. Number five is tricky. Make sure you put the right word in your notes. The range of diseases will change. So, like, we don't have malaria in Santa Barbara because the mosquito that carries malaria doesn't survive very well. Here in Santa Barbara, our winters are a little bit too cold for this mosquito, or are they? We used to say that West Nile virus was not possible in the Americas. It popped up in Central Park a few, maybe 20, 15 years ago. West Nile virus spread down the eastern seaboard, crossed the southern states. My mom and dad's neighbor was the first guy in California to die of West Nile disease. That's a disease that was previously impossible, that now is in Santa Barbara County. There's a lot of diseases that we're not familiar with because we've never faced them before. And these are not necessarily new to, like, humanity. They're just in a new place because they can't spread everywhere unless conditions change to let them spread to a new environment. Medical institutions take a while to catch up. A doctor might not recognize that your fever is combined with other symptoms to make it West Nile disease. And more importantly, you and your mom and dad might not. Like, if your neighbors all start getting West Nile disease, you don't have to freak out. You just sleep under a mosquito net. But how many of us even have mosquito nets? There's parts of the world where everybody uses them because everybody's used to avoiding those mosquitoes that carry those diseases, but we're not. Likewise, our flu is a common seasonal thing that most of us have had flus every single year. But if you get to a population that's never had influenza and you give them a whole new city's worth of flu, that can be an impact that those people may not, their doctors may not recognize, and those citizens may not know how to deal with, how to cope with. So the range of diseases is going to change. Number 6, sea level will continue to rise. There's a lot of things you have to know about sea level. First of all, it's probably good to know the amount. Sea level has risen by maybe 6 inches in the last 100 years. Excuse me. Sea level has been a complicated thing to predict for a very long time because we've continued to learn more about how water moves through the ocean and where the heat goes, how much the heat spreads out. The average temperature of the ocean has been difficult to measure until pretty recently. You know, it's a lot of water. Now we do understand more clearly some things about how the ocean responds to heating. First of all, you have to know that, in addition, you have to know that most sea level rise is from thermal expansion. Those molecules are more excited, so they bounce off each other harder, so they spread out. Thermal expansion. Only a little bit of sea level rise is from new water. Most important thing for you to know, when we talk about sea level rise as a projection in the future of climate, the most important thing that you need to know is not a single person will drown, not one. Because it's not like sea level rises all at once. It's not like a tsunami of sea level rise. You know, as sea level rises a little bit, maybe your house's foundation is now in groundwater, so your house has a problem. Or maybe that part of the road that goes to sea level gets more and more potholes and has to be repaired more often. You know examples because Santa Barbara has those. Think about wastewater treatment facilities. Those are usually very close to sea level, and so we have to keep raising those. I want you to imagine the economic implications of sea level in Santa Barbara rising by a few feet, let's say 3 feet. Not unreasonable by the end of this century. Sea level rise is like a wound up spring. So first you put all the energy into it, and then all of a sudden the energy starts to come out. So we believe that sea level rise has been really, really slow, but it's starting to accelerate. If we get like 3 feet of sea level rise in Santa Barbara, no one's going to drown, no one's going to die. But imagine the cost to our city, right? Just the costs. We have to move the harbor, or at least rebuild the harbor. We have to make the pier more sturdy because it's going to start getting hit by waves. The whole waterfront, Cabrillo Boulevard, I think it's called, the one that goes along the Castillo, whatever, the one that goes along the, Cabrillo, that goes along the waterfront. All the volleyball courts, the zoo is right next to sea level. Our wastewater treatment facility, there's a couple of parks down there. Part of the Santa Barbara City College parking. There's like that one restaurant. Our train station is right above sea level. If you've ever been to the wrong side of the tracks at the train station, you look down at Mission Creek. It's not like sea level will flood everything, but you get closer to the storm surges. So then when you have like big swell with a lot of wind at high tide, storm surges, now you've become susceptible to flooding. That can damage electronics, that can damage plumbing. So eventually you have to recede from the coastline. And once you start to pull back from the coastline, it's not like sea level is going to stop rising. Then 100 years later, you got to keep working on that. No one's going to die, but the funk zone will be closer to sea level. And so there's some houses in the funk. There's a whole bunch of businesses in the funk that are going to have to move. We've got like a couple of waste sorting facilities. We're going to need new ones of those. Our courthouse is something like 7 feet above sea level. Our police station right now is 6.5 feet above sea level. So there's all these little investments that you have to make at once. It's important to remember that almost every world capital is on the ocean because most of the world was colonized along the ocean. I hope that makes sense. Like most of the world capitals were accessed by ships. So capitals were built on the ocean. And so this is not like a problem for a few people. It's a problem for the majority of urban environments on Earth. 1/3 of humanity lives within 300 feet of sea level, the elevation. So if you're living within 300 feet from sea level, that means 1/3 of humanity probably will have impacts on their drinking water, their waste disposal, their energy, and thus their economy. Rising sea level is just a big, stupid, expensive hassle. More damage from storms, got to move everything, got to spend more money rebuilding things. The cost of doing business goes up. I also want you to visualize that, as sea level rises, it spreads a lot further. So like you have a lot of coastline within 1 foot of sea level rise. So when we say sea level rise, it's a lot of real estate impacted, right? It's not like land is a cliff and that climbing water has to reach a point where humans are. Humans are spread out just a teeny little bit above sea level. All right. Number 7. We know the ocean will continue to acidify. I think I've told you before that this was essentially discovered and mapped and described by people at UC Santa Barbara, because we know that oxides plus water makes acid, and we're adding more carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. So it's getting more acidic. And remember that this has huge impacts on ocean productivity overall, because the very, very bottom of the food chain has a whole bunch of things that build a shell. And the ocean is humanity's primary source of protein. By the way, most fish farming is actually farming things with a shell, oysters and clams and stuff. And so the biggest part of humanity's protein supply will be less productive due to ocean acidification, and so will our primary sector in farmed seafood. That's another ding on our global food supply. Number 8, this one is pretty iffy. We don't know how big of a deal it would be. But just like weather shifts, so do currents. And a lot of our modern international relationships and a lot of our international businesses are built around these trade routes. Like it makes sense to like grow it in Ecuador and then ship it over to Japan and then ship it over to Australia and then get it back to South America or whatever. And so it's interesting that trade routes could shift. Slightly mysterious, to be honest, but it's reasonable to assume that trade routes could shift. This might really shuffle the deck of internationally who has power and who doesn't. Probably less of a deal for us and more of a deal for the Southern Hemisphere. Number 9, the severity of hurricanes will go up. And this is one the College Board has relied on before. the severity of a hurricane is the difference between sea temperature and air temperature. And global warming is usually warming the ocean much more than the air. So it's kind of like raising the average hurricane by one category. You've heard of category 1, category 2, category 3, 4, and 5 hurricanes. Category 5 is a really bad one. So the average for hurricanes is around a 1, 2. There's not going to be more of them, but whenever a hurricane comes, it'll on average be a bit stronger. So we're going to shift the average from being a 1, 2 to being a 2, 3, which means we're going to get less of the no big deal kind, and we're going to get more of the bad ones, and we're going to get more of the really bad ones. And we've already been seeing this. This is a big whoop for people who live in the eastern states and the southeast in particular. Also a big deal for typhoons, India, Bangladesh, Indonesia, Philippines, Malaysia. Number 10, I want you to look at your list, see the things you wrote down, and imagine how many of those could affect the economy. And what if I told you that all of those will affect the economy over the next few decades? That's actually a lot. Agriculture supply is strained, water supply is strained, there's new diseases everywhere, the world capitals have to spend all this money trying to stay ahead of sea level. Fisheries and fish farming is going downhill. There's all these weird international relationships that are shifting. Storms becoming more harmful. None of that's cheap, and if you put all that on top of itself, that's kind of a big strain for the economy, especially when you remember that 1/2 of humans live on less than $2.50 a day. Like for you and me, whatever, we're rich, we're fine. But I mean, globally, for the world's poor, these economic implications are really severe. There's a lot of humans who are just scraping by. And so number 11, imagine how many humans would have to move. If you look at 1 through 10, there's a lot of reasons why somebody could move. The primary cause of refugeeism until now has been conflict. But in all the history of global warfare, if you add up all refugees combined, we expect way more than that number to migrate in the coming century alone. Like in your lifetime, you're going to see more people moving on the world's map than have ever moved in the history of all refugeeism as long as we've had humans. These are kind of a new variable in international relationships. They're called environmental or climate refugees. And this is not my kind of migration, opportunity migration. And this is not prisoner of war or military persecution refugeeism like my parents. This is people whose environment doesn't sustain them anymore. It's getting too hard to eat. It's getting too hard to find water. There's no economic growth in my part of the world anymore. This has driven some huge migrations already in your lifetime. Sudan, people moving around in sub-Saharan Africa, people moving around in Syria because of food collapses and water collapses largely. We're getting there. And, like, the funny thing about people who deny climate change is they're in really bad company. Like pretty much credible institutions all over the world, like the US military and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, are already planning for environmental refugeeism. Governments all over the world, international institutions, humanitarian and development agencies, huge branches of the United Nations and the World Health Organization and other international bodies are all preparing for this. We know that people will move around much more. Some things that you should note before I wrap up the study goal. We do have a known amount of warming so far. So in the past century, our planet has warmed up by 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit, pretty close to 2, because the Industrial Revolution started a little bit more than a century ago. And that's about 1 degree Celsius. And also correlates to about 6 inches of total sea level rise. It's important to point out that for the most part, there was very few humans who participated in industrialization back in the day. And while industrialization was speeding up, so was population growth. So this problem follows a really steep curve, and we're at that point where it's really going to take off now. Both temperature gain and sea level rise will accelerate very quickly in your lifetime and your children's lifetime. It's been slow because it's only getting up to steam since about the time that you were born. I also got to remind you that the absolute temperature is not a big whoop. We have had the planet be hotter and be colder, and absolutes don't really matter, but it's how quickly temperature changes. Higher temperatures don't matter and lower temperatures don't matter unless they change quickly. All the mass extinctions were rapid temperature change, all of them. And by rapid, I mean much faster than the background temperature variation. So volcano goes off and changes the atmosphere, meteor hits the earth and shades the planet and cools the earth. Those rapid changes were rapid by geological standards, but our rate of temperature change is somewhere between a few hundred to a few thousand times faster than any of those. Meaning the amount of temperature change that we could see in one lifetime would historically have taken 2 to 10,000 years. It's extremely rapid, way faster than evolution. So our climate reality is the primary driver of the Holocene extinction. So far, it's been habitat issues. You might remember hippo, but climate change and behavioral segregation, ecosystem shear, will be the primary drivers of the current extinction. Then what, right? Like, I'll probably be long dead before that extinction is over or whatever. And you know, climate is going to stabilize. Either humans will survive or they won't, but climate is going to stabilize. The carbon will sink and the climate will return to natural variation. And life, like with a capital L, life, it's going to be fine. Like in the long term, extinction is totally natural. It happens all the time in these big punctuated extinctions that are followed by punctuated speciation. We're going to have another round of amazing, beautiful global diversity. There will be the age of the ants or the age of the squid or the age of the jellyfish or something, but it's going to be rad. And you know, like if you look around, like you and your neighbors, you're probably all gonna be just fine. We live in the richest, most powerful country on earth. We got a ton of resources, we got a ton of land, we got a ton of smart people, we got a ton of money, we got a ton of guns. We're all right. I just kind of wonder, you know, like climate change is something that we're doing to other people much more than we're doing to ourselves. In this country, we're doing it to the people of the future. And throughout the world, we're doing it to the poor. Like my food supply has not gone down. I'm fat. But like, you know, the food supply for people who used to get Russian food aid, their food supply is basically down from food aid only to zero. I kind of feel like people don't need more problems, and this is something that we could fix, you know. Like I've seen some cool stuff that my kids might not see. Like our kelp beds are probably never going to recover to the degree they were when I was a kid. So when I was like third or fourth grade, I remember snorkeling in kelp beds that are no longer there, and I want to take my daughter snorkeling. She and I have been spending a lot of time in the ocean lately, and like when I take her snorkeling, it doesn't look as good, and I kind of feel like, dang, you know, like is this something that I won't be able to show my children? I mean, think of all the stuff that you've seen as a kid that you may not be able to show your children. I think that it's important that we remember, like, climate change is not about like saving my life, but I think we got to put that into perspective. It might be about saving somebody else's life, like right now. Like, don't worry about how you will die. You're going to die happy and healthy. But think about how other people might be dying right now, or like what will be left to show our children, what things they'll lose. My boy's named after a glacier that's no longer a glacier because it's been losing too much weight because it doesn't get enough snow in the winters anymore. So my boy's glacier is gone. There's no more Lyell Glacier. It's a snowfield now. There's still a Merced Glacier, but I don't know how long hers will last. This is something that we can fix. Like, if you know you got to do it, and yeah, it's gonna hurt, but you know you got to do it, you might as well just do it, right? Like, just get it over with. Pull the band-aid. That's kind of how I feel about climate. All right, this is the end of my deep thoughts on climate. I hope that was helpful.